I'm not going to give you the whole paper because we don't have enough time, but at least I will present the first main ideas and then accelerate through some of the things that would follow up from those main ideas. Now, as Rishi just said, in the initial title that I suggested, my intention was to understand why it is that Canada decided to become a multicultural nation. And if you ask that question, you will find that there are books, articles, dissertations addressing that question. But it is obvious to me, even as I ask the question, that that question is really flawed, because we all know that Canada is not the only nation that decided to become a multicultural nation. Some people think that because Canada was the first one to officially announce that it was multicultural, that it follows that it was the first nation or the most advanced. There is no question that Canada, in many ways, has strived and still strives to be the model multicultural nation, to tell the world we are doing it in the proper way here. If you want to do the same, you can learn so much from us. So there is truthfulness to the fact that there is something unique about Canada, and I think it has to do with this pretense that they are the successful, the model, and then that comes along with the first, but the first doesn't quite work. So I decided to frame or come up with a bigger question, while at the same time being aware that the claim that it is a model is true, that there is a lot to that claim, but I'm not going to deal with that question here. So the broader question that I decided to ask is, why is it that Western nations, and only Western nations, committed themselves to mass immigration and diversity? Why do they welcome ethnic rights for non-whites within their own borders while demonizing any expression of white identity? Many people sometimes confuse the words that I use here. They say, well, is it not the case that the Irish, the Germans, the Scandinavians can express their ethnicity? They have clubs where they do their dances, they hear their songs, and so on. But what I mean by ethnic rights is something stronger than that. I really mean, why is it that they cannot, European Canadians, affirm themselves as a race with certain racial characteristics, and also as a cohesive group that is not just splintered into Scandinavian, Irish, and it's about folksy things that you may do. I'm speaking about affirming your ethnic identity in a political way. And we know that across the West, blacks can affirm their identity racially in a political way. We know that Hispanics or mestizos can do the same thing, and we know that Asians can do the same thing. So that's what I'm talking about. Why is it that the very nations that introduce multicultural rights for many other groups decided that it would be wrong and unacceptable for Euro-Canadians to do the same thing? So this is the question, and it is a question that has many questions within it, or there are many ways of framing this question. So another way of framing the question is, why would an ethnic group, a people with common racial characteristics, a common culture, rooted in a land with a historical memory, kinship ties, and ancestry, mandate its own transformation into a radically different type of people. Now, I'm not going to get into this here, but I do believe that Euro-Canadians are rooted in this land. If you examine the Quebecois, there is no question that they were born in the soul of Quebec as a new people, and so were the Acadians. And the statistics shows that there was barely any immigration from the outside coming into Quebec from the early 1600s all the way to the time that the British take over in 1763. I won't get into the estimates now, but it was very few immigrants coming into Quebec. The same thing with the Acadians. A few landed and then they created themselves through a very high birth rate. The Loyalists came from one region of British North America to another region of British North America. They were born in British North America, and they also created themselves through their own labor and their own high birth rate. And similar statements can be made about a whole range of other groups. So I do mean to say, or ask, why is it that a people that's rooted, that has ancestry in a land, somehow decides that they are no less important, they are just one more group among thousands of others that can claim the same legitimacy in this land, because that has no precedent in human history, that you can actually say that other people that may have just arrived 10 years ago have the same legitimacy to a land that you have created. So it is a big question. It has no parallels elsewhere in human history. And so, asking this big question, I began to think that there were a number of big factors responsible for why it is that Canadians decided to transform themselves. And I had to have in my mind the fact that so had the Australians, so had the Americans, the New Zealanders, and that indeed all of Europeans, with the exception of the Eastern Europeans who were protected by communism, but in Britain the same was happening, in Spain, in Italy, similar phenomena. And so, as I was researching this and thinking that the concept of human rights was an important factor, I came up across this term, spiral diffusion model. And I don't have too much time to explain that term, but I'll sum it up this way. Basically, what political scientists, legislators, and social workers were interested in promoting human rights in the third world, they argue that one of the keys to get a country to start taking seriously human rights is that you have to get them to take some first big steps that set like an anchor within those nations, from which then further sustained improvements in human rights can follow. And so they point to countries that have begun to move in a more human rights direction for this human rights dynamic to take place in those countries. They say that these countries can be made to sign human rights treaties, like the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. So they get together a bunch of third world nations, and there are economic issues going around. They'll get further trade on this or that product, but the idea is get them to sign human rights treaties that then obligate them to act in a more human rights fashion. Another way is that they tell the third world country, we're going to bring 20 countries there, a bunch of associations and people, and showcase a set of new ideas and perspectives on how to promote human rights. So that country then becomes the beneficiary of having a conference with many people from the world coming there. It raises its status, there's lots of news. And so what this spiral diffusion model argues is that gradually and slowly you sort of entrap this third world nation to get caught up in a human rights dynamic. So that you tell them, don't you remember you signed that treaty? Don't you remember you were the host of this conference so that you don't discriminate against women? So they hold them to account whenever they violate the human rights of a woman or a prisoner and so on. So this idea, there's more details to it, but they use other terms like embedded. They try and get as many countries in the third world to be embedded, attached to this human rights dynamic. The more embedded they are, the more stronger the dynamic becomes, the more rooted these principles become in actual laws and so on. So I believe that this image of a spiral diffusion dynamic can be used to answer the important questions that I raised above. That is the question why Western nations decided to become multi-racial places. I'll skip this because there's no time. And then the question for us then is, when did it happen in the West that we had such a foothold? We don't know what it is, but it seems to be that at some pro-immigration foothold was planted that began to push the whole society in the West in that direction, in a kind of spiraling dynamic, ever more and more in that direction. And what I argue is that this spiral was made possible in the West when certain basic normative conditions were put in place in the West, and that I believe that it was really during, but really after the Second World War, that certain basic normative conditions were put in place from which then a spiral took off that has driven the West in this direction. And I emphasize spiral because when you go back in time and you see Canada, for example, signing a treaty with the UN to the effect that they believe in human rights, that sounds innocent enough, but as you examine how this treaty affects Canada's way of treating immigrants and refugees, you see that it really starts to have an effect in pushing Canada in an ever more radicalizing direction, to the point that we now think that if somebody lands in Canada, that person practically has the same rights as any other Canadian, and there is no way you can push them out of the country. How much time do I have? Oh, 15? 15, okay, yeah, so I'm going to jump a lot here and get to the four normative factors that I think were in place in the West, and that these four normative factors contain within them a dynamic that would entrap all Westerners into the situation we are today. Because the situation we are today is really, really pathological. It is absolutely insane. And so I don't think that when I look at these norms as they were there in the 1940s and 50s, that the people who were thinking about these norms and accepting them, that they were pathological at that time. I don't think so. Something happened. These norms had a dynamic that brought us into this insane state of affairs that we are today. And that is part of the mystery in many ways, that you can accept this and accept that, and you don't realize there is snowballing effect, that you're going to be let down there, down right into some mud pile there, without realizing that you were just driven there without even thinking about it. Now, keep in mind that, well, I'll leave this aside because there will not be enough time. So let me get to the four things. First, after World War II, the following normative state of affairs prevailed across the West. First, Nazism was the worst evil of modern times, and it was about racism and German white supremacy. Western governments concluded that Nazi and fascist governments had committed crimes against humanity. The Holocaust was a demonstration of the inhumanity of those ideologies that divided humans into superior and inferior races. A nationalism in which a particular ethnic group laid privileged claim over the nation state was accordingly thoroughly discredited as inherently inconsistent with the ideals of liberal democracy. Over and over again, Western leaders began to announce that a true liberal state must be civic in orientation, based only on liberal values and not on any ethnic identity. And it must be neutral on matters of religion. That to be a liberal, to follow the logic of separation of church and state, meant that even if Christianity may have played a big role in the making of Canada, it meant that you had to neutralize that role and separate Christianity from any identification with what it means to be Canadian. Secondly, and these are all interconnected, after World War II, and there are intellectuals working before, but really after World War II, there was an outlawing of race. You don't talk about race and race differences. And there was a discrediting of scientific racism, or the study of race from a scientific perspective. Western elites systematically spread out the idea, which up until World War II was held only by a few, that there is no such thing as a science of race. The differences between nationalities are primarily due to cultural, environmental factors. The differences of biology are superficial. There can be no scientific justification for racial discrimination. Rather, discriminatory policies are creations of pathological individuals with an irrational fear of groups that are different in appearance. So that's the second big norm that spreads throughout the West. The third one is that there was a discrediting of Western colonialism coupled with a celebration of third world peoples as the next human emancipators. And Gandhi is a case in point, this obsession of Gandhi as the most ethical person that all whites had to look up to. Western imperialism was inconsistent with human emancipation across the world and the liberal idea that all peoples should have a right to national self-determination. Alongside these anti-colonialist sentiments came a new emphasis on the ethnic rights of people of color, both outside and inside Western nations, to enjoy self-determination and equality without discrimination in employment and in voting rights. And you can see this in the American civil rights movement and in the demand of other minorities in various Western countries. These demands came along with the spread of the idea that all cultures are equal and that the whites who rose to dominance did so by exploiting the third world, blacks and indigenous peoples. People underestimate this, but across all universities, students are taught, and blacks, that what whites achieve, why they industrialize first, why they have more wealth and affluence, was because they took it from other people through the slave trade, through the exploitation of the Americas, the decimation of the native peoples, the continued oppression of blacks in the United States. And this is inside the psyche of all non-whites. They really believe you took it from us and we're going to take it back from you. That's the way it works. You did not do anything that you deserve to be proud of. In fact, you should be ashamed of yourself, even though it is the other way around. It is absolutely the other way around. Everything that they have, the West gave it to them. Whether it is the electricity, whether it is the transportation, whether it is the medicine, it was given to them through diffusion from here to those areas of the world. But that's not how they think. And since they don't know the history of the West, they don't know that that is the case. And even if they knew, they're not going to accept it because they have a sense of ethnic pride and identity, unlike whites who have been deprived of it and can't say it. I mean, one of the ways that I move in this direction is that I started studying Western civilization. I realized how many lies I had been told, and that I was just going to say it. If Western science was invented by Europeans, I'll say it because that is what happened. If 97% of the greatest scientists in human history were European, well, they were. And if 98% of the greatest discoverers were European, I'm just going to say it. And it's not just a matter of saying it factually, but it's a way of regaining your sense of identity and ancestry, and then letting them know that you're not going to back down. People that backs down, you send a green light to other people that you're going to be a walkover. The moment you say, oh, you hesitate, you apologize for the slave trade, don't apologize for it. It had nothing to do with the slave trade. Just shrug your shoulders. The same thing with Aboriginals. All that nonsense has gone out of hand. You don't have to speak ill of Aboriginals. I respect them insofar as they fought back. The Indians, they're not Aboriginals, they're Indians. So far as they fought back, you respect them for that. But you don't treat them as welfare characters, you know, begging for things. It devalues them. And they know it. That's not good for them. Oh, force. Sorry, I could keep going. So, for the rise of human rights and the norm that the liberal principles of equality, dignity, and self-determination had to be applied universally to all humans without distinctions of race and nationality. This is more difficult than it may seem. I never used to think that human rights was that important. But then I realized that the essence of human rights is that the liberal rights that Europeans invented for themselves are now being extended to the rest of the world. We are saying that they must have the same rights of freedom of speech, of election, of equality. So, you see the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Article 2. Everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language. The right to live, liberty, security of the person are inherent to human beings. So they're not rights that you find historically among a particular people, but we were told, no, there are rights that are inherent to all human beings across the world. So you, whiteys, you better go out there and start taking care of everybody. And this is what they have been doing, going to Africa, feeding them and feeding them and feeding them, and that population is exploding, and they're all coming here. Wait till it's happening in India, massive population growth. So, you know, these are complicated things. There's theories. Talk about this. Spend time saying how it is that if you're going to have a proper cosmopolitan understanding of liberal rights, then other peoples from other lands have rights to Germany. Turks are no less Germans than the Germans themselves. Muslim is no less a religion to Germany than Christianity. Why? Because it is the right for them to declare that that is the case. History says that's absurd. History says Muslims play zero role in Germans' history. But the idea of human says, oh, would you want to violate the human rights of a group of Muslims who believes that they are part of the German national culture? And you can if you follow the principle of human rights. So with the last few minutes, what I'm just going to say is that to me, this then is the platform for the spiral. These ideas, in and of themselves, contain valid principles. If you're a liberal, you can say, you know, I can go with some of these ideas. But there is a spiral in them. For example, if there are no differences between the races, why should Canada have immigration laws that restrict Asians from coming here? It follows logically that it makes no difference. Why do you have those laws? And Canada was pressed by outsiders, even Jamaica, Pakistan. They will hold them to account and embarrass the poor Canadian. You still have that. You haven't changed it fully. Oh, you're going to call you're a racist Canadian. You claim you're not. And they're just like, yeah, we got to change this. So eventually they change it into a points system in 1962. But then it was not enough, because they tried to find ways to still keep Canada white. And one way is only whites can bring members of their family beyond the immediate family. People of color, you don't bring them, because they're going to say you have too many of them. And then they hold that with the skills. They didn't have the skills yet. They would not come in here. But by 1967, they were forced to get rid of the restrictions related to bringing members of the extended family. So they got rid of it. And so in that sense, they became equal and have an equal right to it. Then the next thing was, oh, why is it that Canadian has offices only or mostly in the United States, Britain, and Europe? That's racist. Why don't you open offices in Jamaica and Pakistan and start encouraging them to come? And then comes multiculturalism in 1971. So then they do set up offices. And at that point, in my view, no one was saying, we want what we have today. It was like they were taking one step that initiated a series of other steps. And this is complicated. There's also the march to institutions that is going on. People from the left walk into liberalism and transform that ideology to mean something very different from what it really means. Yeah. Because liberalism is a good ideology. Mm-hmm. It was an ideology that grew among Western peoples. It means, you know, freedom of expression, a sense of individuality. You don't want the state dictating to you everything that you do. But the liberalism that we have now, there are all kinds of restrictions on freedom of speech. I couldn't say what I'm saying openly in any university. You just can't. Yes.
I stumbled onto a phenomenon called entryism when I typed into my search engine, Marxism has infiltrated liberalism. And I don't know if you're familiar with this concept, where basically Marxists have been infiltrating liberal political movements and spreading their ideology through liberalism. Yeah. Because nobody else would believe them as Marxists.
Right, that happened is cultural Marxism.
Yeah.
When they realized that communism in the economic sphere was not working as they had anticipated, they developed another strategy, which is to go after the culture and transform it slowly. And one of the things they did was to infiltrate liberal ideas. I think Wilkin Leaker, who is a foremost theorist of Canadian multiculturalism, this is what he did. Speaking of the spiral, if you look at Canadians in the 1950s, late 40s, who were saying that Canada still has discrimination laws in employment, I as a liberal could agree that this is not fair. If you do have blacks here or from other nationalities, we shouldn't have public parks where you exclude them because they're already here. They were born here. So I can see the people who were pushing for these things. But then comes the question of not only giving them the same rights that every other Canadian has, but then they came up with ideas like institutional racism, that there was something that was against them coming from the whole of the institutions. And then they came up with the idea that in order for them to be fully protected, they needed extra rights, extra protections, which then becomes group rights, which means that they get certain funding for their culture or their activities that other Canadians do not get. It means that they get affirmative employment, which you see it is now pervasive. I mean, with just the Syrians who just recently arrived in New Brunswick, there is a mandate. You have got to hire them because we want to make this successful. So the Canadian that was there all his life, trying to get a job, so then you have to step back. So you can see this radicalization going on, and at that point it seems to me that that's not liberalism anymore. And Charles Taylor acknowledges that with his communitarianism. He says we are pushing for communitarian ideas in the sense that we believe that groups and not individuals can have rights. But when you ask Taylor, so what about group rights for white or European Canadians? No way are they going to get it. That's a neo-Nazi idea.
Is it really fair to keep liberalism from that kind of criticism? And a lot of what you seem to be talking about seems to echo Alexis de Tocqueville's commentary in Democracy in America, that once you expand a franchise, it can't stop expanding to more and more individuals, and that will eventually, whatever limitations might be starting with, it will eventually break down, and that, you know, it tends in that direction to opening up to more and more. Isn't that kind of where we arrived? Isn't the cultural Marxist infiltration kind of built in as a feature of liberalism that can't be really avoided?
Well, liberalism is a risky way of thinking because it allows for open viewpoints. And you know, there's a lot of debate going on within the alternative right. Some call for certain collective controls. But let's take the issue of race. If through free inquiry the decision is reached, it's always tentative, but it is reached, that there are significant differences between races on matters of behavior, mannerisms, and things of that nature, then you arrive at that point, at that view, through liberal inquiry, open liberal inquiry. Then you also, through open inquiry, reach the view that human beings have strong ethnocentric inclinations, and that it is healthy for them to belong in societies where they can relate to the groups that are around, that they speak the same languages, have certain other similarities.
It's called homophily. It's that phenomenon of bias towards similar others.
Yeah.
Is called homophily.
Okay, so a liberal reaches that point, and then the liberal can reach a collective decision that collectivism is good. It's just that liberalism, some the libertarians took it to mean you have to disaggregate everything. But the libertarian has never been able to understand from where does this idea come from. The very libertarianism that they praise. Fact is, it only comes from white people. And it has deep background in the history of whites. Why is it that for a long time they were the most individually inclined? Whereas other people have tended always to be more collective. But that doesn't mean whites were not collective. The Germans have tended to be more collective than they.
Can I just ask you? I think it's absolutely right what you've been saying, and what I think about the Western side of the world is up until First World War, we were all slaves. The working class were all slaves up until the First World War.
That's right.
And when they came out here, it was for a better life.
That's right.
So the people who come here have the opportunity of a better life. And I don't think they should have the opportunity to change the life that's here already, which is a better life. And that is where the politicians are letting you down.
Yeah.
I'm just logical, and I'm old, and I've seen it all. So I just thought I'd have to say that.
All right, that's good.
But I really agree with what you say. You're just being allowed to change things. And it's not that you're racist, because I have mixed with lots of different races in my life. I have many friends. It's not racist. It's fighting on a sense for your life and your children's life. And they're coming out of no life and want to change it back to 2,000 years ago. Because we have evolved from 2,000 years from the countries that they've come from. And it's not been racist. It's just, there's a better life here. And if they can't adapt to it, then they shouldn't come.
Yeah,
It's
but we
simple.
know,
They have
but
a
we know
choice.
that. We
I
know that,
but
so why are they?
Why are your politicians allowing it?
Exactly, because they're trying to break us down, is what they're doing.
Well, you have the votes.
Yes,
True.
what are you going to say?
I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the idea of capitalism as kind of being the alienating factor within the West. You mentioned earlier in your speech that the Eastern Bloc has not suffered the same sort of human rights dogma. So is that one of the possible conditions?
Like at the end, I mentioned those four big factors, but I say that two come up later out of that dynamic of those factors feeding each other and radicalizing everything. And that is the ethnic vote and the economic factor that we need immigrants to sustain a growing capitalist economy. When Canada had immigration restrictions, they were really looking for immigrants, and in the 19th century, and they wanted immigrants to get the economy growing, so you can call that capitalism. But they were also determined that it had to be a certain type of immigrant, and it had to be white, preferably Anglo-Saxon, but if not, you could get Southern and Eastern Europeans and then get them to assimilate. And so it isn't as if, in the pursuit of profits at that time, they just said whoever comes. It was like, no, it has to be a certain type of person. Now later on, after the 1950s, there are signs that people don't want to come from Europe. It just drops. So the economic factor does kick in, that we do need to reform these immigration restrictions, because right now we're not getting enough from Europe. So it plays a role. But I still think that the bigger role was played by the norms which said that it would be racist, this is third world peoples, human rights, that played a bigger role. And that ultimately, it seems to me, you can have a nation that is capitalist and has close borders like Japan and South Korea. So the notion that if you have capitalism, you automatically have open borders is not true. You can have both. Japan, I mean, there's a lot of pressure because they have the biggest, block of aging people and the smallest one of young people. So they feel we're going to hit a wall here. And I hear now and then that they're going to open the borders. But if they do, I know what's going to happen. The Japanese are just going to put them in fences and stuff like that. They're not going to allow many of them. So, yes.
But then wouldn't that model suggest that the kind of restrictions you talked about in the 19th century on white immigration from Europe that built up Canada's population at the time, it wasn't based in some kind of liberal inquiry into knowing what, say, Robert Putnam contributes to what we know now about having ethnically homogenous communities. Like they didn't have that kind of scientific basis on which to establish that policy. It was more based on a sense of tradition and hierarchy and authority and leadership rather than some kind of methodical, scientifically arrived at model that says, well, this is optimal because the algorithm says so. And isn't that maybe too the explanation for why Japan is able to have the model you just summarized, is that it stems from a sense of leadership and obligation and
Yes.
tradition and not liberal values?
They have an authoritarian form of capitalism. But I see your point. You're saying that liberalism at some point will break apart and not be able to mount a
It's like
proper.
cancer.
Yeah, it will not be able to mount. As I said, I think that there are certain collectivist forms that coexist with liberalism. I think racial collectivism is consistent with liberalism. Ethnic collectivism, I think, is consistent because, for me, Europeans are argumentative people by nature, and to and force them to think the same way, which is what they are doing now. You call it liberalism, but that's not liberalism. That you're not allowed to express alternative viewpoints today. So it's a form of imposed collectivism. But we can have a healthier collectivism that is based on the interests of the people, on human nature, on what the science says.
It's interesting what you're saying. I know in the 1990s, Pierre Trudeau made a statement, or he was asked publicly, if what has happened, how Canada had developed was what he was envisioning when he first was implementing these programs, and he said, no, it wasn't.
Yeah. I sometimes think that what if Trudeau saw his song and what he's thinking. I mean, it is your song, and you always have affection for your song. But if you were to sort of separate, let's say it wasn't even Justin there, but someone else, and really saying, I'm doing this all in the name of Trudeau, they really would have seen something happen that I never ever anticipated. If you have them walk around Richmond, inside Toronto, and that's what I mean, that when we look for causes, where did this come from? There is a tendency to say, in the case of some people, they go all the way back to Christianity, or even the Greeks. Some go back to the Protestant religion, others to the Enlightenment. And they say these are the roots of where we are, all liberalism. Some just blame liberalism. And I agree, all these factors are there as long-term factors. But something in my view happened with the Second World War, because when I look at Canada, Australia, the United States, New Zealand, and Europe, and you look at their immigration policies, they had a very strong sense of ethnic cohesion. Mackenzie King in 1947, a famous statement he made that we will not bring immigrants that we believe will threaten the national character of Canada. We're just not going to do that, and the government has a right to make that decision and no one else. And then he's going against the principle of human rights. Because a human rights person will say, no, there are human rights that stand above your nation because humans everywhere have these rights and not just you and Canadians. But he's kind of saying at that point, not yet. By the 50s, the Canadians begin to wobble and change, and more. And you know, in the 70s, in newspapers, you would find journalists that could talk in a quite open way against immigration, and this is going to destroy Canada's identity, and this is not good. By the 70s, I mean by the 90s, so recent, you see they're getting quieter and quieter because the depression grows and grows. And then you have millions of other groups, ethnic groups, they become forces in their own right. And they're going to come after you, and societies, and organizations, and journalists, and academics, they're everywhere. So at that point, it's like the whole system is rigidified and deeply penetrated through the whole of Canadian institutions. And so it becomes very difficult to change it, and also to think that people, when they were talking in the 70s, could have anticipated this. Yes.
Yeah, that paper looks like a very interesting sort of post-mortem on where we're at now. But how do you think liberalism will evolve? Like, would something like Frank Salter describes, or like Duchesne, like a universal nationalism, would that be like the next step of liberalism, or would you like continue towards what we're seeing now, where it's more individual based rather than community?
I don't think about what's going to come later, because politics will take care of it. If in Canada, a sizable proportion of the white population would start saying we had enough and we're going to affirm our identity, that will generate an incredible dynamic that begins to change. And that's good enough. If you look at the revolutions of France, what happened was never intended. They had many phases. It started with an aristocratic revolt, the French Revolution. Then you had the bourgeois revolution. Then the peasants and the sans-culottes get in, and they radicalize the revolution. And then other groups get in. And so it's like, once these aristocrats begin to talk with Enlightenment ideas, and the bourgeoisie declare the rights of man, there's like a dynamic and momentum there in politics. Sort of, I'm not trying to say the spiral is everywhere now, but I do think that, or at least in my case, I'm not worried with developing a theory of what is going to be the way we will live. There are many people making arguments like that. Greg Johnson is good at it. But